This is a Christmas reading from NorthWest of 16 by J.G. MacGregor. Reading begins partway through chapter 8 of our book. Our school soon became the center of the community, and it was never more so than at Christmas time. I suppose they still have Christmas concerts in every country school. In fact, I know they do, because occasionally there is an item in one of the daily papers about one. But now the country schools are nearly all consolidated into central schools with many classrooms, and now the Christmas tree is lit with electricity. The essence of the Christmas spirit is still there, but the little touches that meant so much 40 years ago are all changed. Maybe it is just because I'm getting older, but it seems to me that there never has been, and never again can be, anything in this world so jolly and so genuine as the Christmas concerts in the old Cotswold School about the year 1912. I feel sorry for the poor teachers. They were kindly mortals who plunged into the spirit of Christmas and worked their heads off, and worried themselves to the verge of a nervous breakdown. The teacher had to select the program. She had to decide that little Millie so-and-so was to be an angel, and that Muriel somebody else was to be a fairy, and that Mrs. such-and-such's little girl would sing to the accompaniment of the old organ which Mrs. Allen usually played. She had to pick somebody to say a piece. Then there would be the plays and the skits, all having some relation to Christmas time. It must have been quite a job. Everyone had to have a part, including the big boy, who was pretty stupid and could not remember a poem 2 stanzas long, and she had to be so careful not to offend any of the parents. Talk about tact! Why, compared to the schoolteacher's task, the work of diplomats is child's play. Whenever I recall those old Christmas concerts, the picture of Brother Bill making his debut as an actor comes back. That Christmas, he was to say a piece. For weeks, Mother had coached him with care until he was letter perfect. I forget the poem now, but it was something about Bethlehem, stars, shepherds, and the Christ child compressed into 6 saccharine lines. Bill knew it well. Dad, whose soul sometimes rebelled at too much sweetness and who, on occasion, loved a practical joke, had taught Bill another, different poem. Bill enjoyed it, but his chuckles evoked from Mother only reproof for him and severe censure for Dad. Unfortunately, this poem stuck in Bill's head when, in a crisis, all but it had fled. The concert that year ground ruthlessly on. The room was full. Proud mothers beamed as their little ones recited, lisped, or sang. Bored fathers sought desperately for some relief to the tedium. Bill gave it to him. In his turn, he marched out onto the stage, red-faced and perspiring, his freckles aglow, his wiry hair standing straight up. As he confronted the packed room, he stared, aghast. His hands did not appear to hang at his sides so much as to be drawn towards the floor by an all-powerful magnet. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Mother fidgeted. The teacher prompted. Half the class hissed, "Billy, 'twas Christmas Eve in the stable." But it did no good. The open mouth was empty until the wildly roving eyes encountered Dad's smile. Then inspiration filled Bill. He took a long breath and recited faultlessly. "Who took me from my warm, warm cot and put me on the cold, cold pot, whether I wanted to go or not?" Then, pointing happily, he roared out the last line, "My mother!" The uproar was deafening. Never before had the roof of the school resounded to such applause. Mother, red-faced and humiliated, reserved her comments for Dad on the way home. Not the least memorable thing about those Christmas concerts was the change that occurred during the day. In the morning, we all went to school as usual, though the only work we did was to brush up on the parts we were to play in the coming concert. When we were dismissed at noon, as we invariably were, the school was its normal, drab self. When we came back in the evening, however, a magic wand had swept over it. During the afternoon, one or two of the men had gone over to Jim Allen's place, and there they had cut and triumphantly borne back a magnificent Christmas tree. During the afternoon, too, all the mothers in the community had dashed down to decorate the school and the tree. When we saw it again, the schoolroom was an enchanted place. Usually it was cold outside, and the windows were all frosted up. One by one the parents came in, taking off their heavy coats and hanging or piling them in the anteroom, and then with eyes aglow would walk into the magic they had helped to create. Sitting in the audience, they faced the platform of rough spruce boards knocked together that afternoon and covered with red and green crepe paper. At the right, occupying a third of the platform, was the Christmas tree. I suppose in those old days in Alberta at Christmas time, there were well over 4,000 of these school Christmas trees, and each one of them was radiant with magic. Ours was decked with tinsel streamers, draped from one branch to another, around and around the tree, and wrapped in the other direction with snowy ropes of strung popcorn, white and puffy, glowing in the lights. And the tree was alive with Christmas lights, little wax candles, red, blue, green, and white, each one placed so that it would not set fire to the branches above it, and each one flickering away, shining on the presents and the decorations of the tree. From the tips of the branches sticking out beyond the lights, and the red and green garlands and the shiny tinsel, hung the lightest Christmas presents. Further into the tree, next to the trunk, were the presents that would balance there. Others were tied to the branches, and any spaces that were left were filled up with gaudy glass balls, the same type as we use today. But these alternated with walnuts, strung up I forget how, and with striped candy canes and candied apples, and hung here and there between the Christmas stockings were gauze bags, red and blue and green and yellow, filled with walnuts, Brazil nuts, peanuts, and hazelnuts, filled with Mrs. Johnston's popcorn, Mrs. Allen's white walnut fudge, and Mrs. Kipp's butterscotch. Oh, there simply wasn't enough room on the tree to hang all of these, so the rest were piled on the floor. Shining from the top of the tree would be some sort of star or an angel, or possibly good old Santa Claus himself. At its foot, piled high, were all the presents you could think of, packaged in red and blue paper. Dolls and rocking horses and everything else that the parents could make or could afford or could buy from Eaton's catalog. In good years, the mound was 4 feet deep. For the children of parents who could not afford presents, a collection had been taken up in some mysterious way so as to assure that every child at the Christmas tree got one present, at least, with his name on it. There was no suspicion in any little mind that this was not wholly the sorcery of Santa Claus. There was no knowledge that for months past mothers had been scrimping and saving, a nickel here, a dime there, putting them into the old crock well back on the top shelf of the cupboard. No excited, tousled head ever knew that on a night a month before, after bedtime, Mother had turned up the coal oil lamp as she sat poring over Eaton's catalog, filling in an order blank, so that on this great night Santa might thrust into eager little hands a mouth organ, a teddy bear, or a doll. No shining eyes that on this night reflected all the expectancy of Christmases had seen the tears fall on the order blank when item after item had to be scratched off the list and a fresh calculation made. Children knew nothing of the secret moonlight walk their mother had made to get the parcel from the post office and into the house and stowed away while they slept serenely. Nor did they know that night after night Mother had knitted mitts, stockings, and toques, while Father worked beside her, planing and sawing, rasping and sanding, so that there should be toys by the tree. When the concert part of the evening was over, when the last boy had mumbled his lines, when the last gauzy angel had swept off the stage, one red flannelette pant leg drooping below her filmy skirt, when the teacher had ceased prompting and perspiring, a hushed silenced the chatter in the overheated room. It was then that Otis Johnston came running down the road, turned in at the school gate, ringing his sleigh bells like mad, and galloping thrice around the school, yelling, "Whoa, whoa," at his reindeer. It was then that Joe Fowley pounded and scraped at the outside of the windowless north wall, helping Santa's sleigh mount to the roof. All eyes turned from the tree to the trapdoor in the ceiling. Santa's red legs dropped through the hole. With his makeup smeared from the heat of the attic, he wiggled his way down, panting and puffing, tugging to bring his beard back from below his ear, and patting back into place the pillow that formed his tummy, and which the narrow hole had jammed around his neck. For a moment he beamed from the stage before explaining how he had been afraid he wouldn't make it through the drifts by Bybank's pasture. And then he would see Billy Hoogers and greet him, and Nellie Dodson, and Alida Bybank, and Cecil James, and Bessie Mason. Why, he seemed to know them all. Of course they all knew him, for here once more was Santa Claus. Even when Brother Bill cried out, "Daddy, it's Daddy!" no one noticed or believed him. Such a rustling of paper as presents were torn open, such blowing of horns and shouting, such happy prattle, such running and yelling you never heard before. Such a scene, such a happy throng as filled Cotswold Schoolhouse that night was never duplicated, except in 4,000 other schoolhouses on the same night. It can never be repeated. You can't describe Christmas. Only in the heart, or in the shining eyes, or in the memory of a child is there a fit description of Christmas. Chapter 9. Christmas on the farm began with the concert and went on for many days. From the school, it followed us home and hovered around until Christmas Eve. At 3 o'clock the next morning it resumed again, and when, before noon, we went to Otis Johnston's with Chappie and Charlie hitched to the old sleigh, it followed us there. Christmas dinner at Johnston's, with its loads of food, should have been enough to put it to sleep for another year, just as it put all of us children to sleep. But it didn't. Christmas was still around when the Johnstons came over to our shack on the NorthWest of 16 for New Year's Day. We'll get to all those things when I have set down just one more memory of those school concerts. I remember one year when Dad, Mother, Bill, and I decided to walk the 1.5 miles to the school. There was a mere inch of fresh snow, and the evening was just cold enough to keep it from melting, so we 4 tramped expectantly along the old bush road. When the concert was over, the full white moon was riding high in the sky. Several neighbors offered us a ride, but the night was too beautiful to be hurried away by riding. After the last sleigh load had passed us, we 4 had the night, the bush road, and the moon to ourselves. Tired? Well, maybe Mother was, but she would not admit it. If excitement tires, Bill and I were ready to drop, but at that moment we did not realize it. Mother and Dad walked along at an easy pace, while Bill and I marched ahead, blowing triumphantly on a mouth organ and a tin bugle. There was no music to it, but what we lacked in music we made up in noise, while the bush road shuddered at the discord. What the old owl sitting in the twin-topped spruce thought, no one knew. What the whiskey jacks and rabbits thought, no one heeded. How startled were the partridges, perched 10 at a time in the great poplars. No one cared. It was Christmas. The concert was over, and surfeited with joy, we tootled our way home. I still remember turning now and then to wait for Dad and Mother, and seeing the white forms of rabbits crouched under the bush piles, silent and still, but watching and ready to bolt further into the woods. I can still remember the great gap through the trees that was the old trail. I can still see the snow-carpeted forest with the huge poplars swaying gently, while in their topmost branches, black, round balls that in the morning would become partridges were silhouetted against the moon, sliding silently past the clouds. On the northwest of 16, with its combined English and Scots traditions, both Christmas and New Year's were savored to the full. In those good old days, a case of Scotch whiskey cost only a few dollars. Whoever made the trip to Edmonton before Christmas brought back a case of whiskey for Henry Paulson, one for Dad, one for Joe Fowley, and perhaps for others. Now, a case of quarts, pre-First World War quarts of Teacher's Highland Cream, represented a lot of alcohol, and if used wisely, a lot of merriment. The Christmas concert, I forgot to say, was usually on the last Friday before Christmas. That usually left a few days of anticipation before Christmas Eve. Whoever brought out the Christmas cheer this particular year delivered our case during this interval. December 24th dawned upon a light fall of fresh, fluffy snow. A good breakfast of fried moose liver and fried potatoes started us off to a proper enjoyment of the great day. No work, except the necessary chores, was done that day, although Joe and Dad opened the case of whiskey and fortified themselves against possible frostbite. Axel Clausen came over, and the three men communed together at one side of the big kitchen table. Bill and I played about in the snow with Jip, one of a long succession of dogs all named Jip. As dusk began to gather, a dozen or so turkeys sought roosts on the roof of the hen house, on the hay rack, and even in a tree or two. One of them, a huge gobbler, had been fattened with care. His flight to the top of the hen house reminded Mother that it was time to kill him, so that he could hang until New Year's Day. Accordingly, she called upon the three men to go out and slay the gobbler, promising to have supper ready by the time they had done so. But one story led to another, and supper was ready before the deed was done. "All right," said Mother, "right after supper then." After supper, the men sallied forth to the woodpile for the axe, while Bill and I, hopping about in anticipation, ran ahead to point out the last roosting place of the turkey gobbler on top of the hen house. But it was not just as simple as the men had planned. The gobbler, aroused by the hullabaloo, craned his long neck and tried to make out all the reason for this uproar. 5 voices rose on the evening air, shouting at him to come down, for who would get at him up there? A 6th voice awakened all the sleeping turkeys as Jip joined in. The impressive bird gobbled in annoyance. From their posts high above the yard, from the hayrack, the trees, and the barn roof, the lesser gobblers joined the medley, while the turkey hens chattered nervously. "Throw something at 'em," suggested Joe, and a rain of missiles clattered on the hen house roof, all falling short but alarming the hens, so that they added their voices to the din. Chappie and Charlie, who had previously been dozing over at the straw pile, were aroused and came galloping in to share the fun. Bunty, secure in the cow barn, raised her voice. "Get your .22 and shoot him," suggested Axel. "But I don't want to make holes in him," muttered Dad. "Get a pole and a wire and snare him. Get a ladder and the pitchfork. Where's Jim's bow and arrow?" The pole and the snare wire seemed to be the best bet, but elbows that had bent all afternoon were not connected with steady hands, and the wire only tickled the gobbler. Other turkeys left their perches and milled around the yard in alarm, but the prize of the flock refused to leave the safety of the hen house. "Let's go back into the kitchen and steady our nerves and talk things over while the turkeys settle down," said Joe. Since this was the most practical idea brought forward so far, it was adopted with only Bill and me and Jip dissenting. The consultation refreshed the men, and they came out filled with a new determination. This time they came brandishing Dad's salmon rod, complete with 100 feet of fishing line and a lump of lead dangling at the end of it. They marched resolutely on the hen house, but the gobbler had flown. He was soon located in the company of 3 disturbed turkey hens behind the straw pile. As the chase resumed, he registered annoyance and stamped on the ground. When 3 determined men rushed at him from 3 different directions, he neatly eluded them by flying to the top of the pile. Here he rocked with anger, pointing out his thrust-out head right towards his pursuers, while flaming away in the moonlight, his red wattles swaying in time to his angry gobbling. Swish went the salmon rod, creak, creak sang the reel, and whack went the lump of lead against his long wing feathers. The cast, intended to encircle his neck or legs, had missed. The challenging gobbler stopped abruptly as anger gave way to anxiety, and he flew down the other side of the pile and ran off. The tempo of pursuit quickened as the gobbler, leading a dozen or so frightened hens, streaked around the barn and raced off through the trees. Axel led the attackers with Joe right behind, while Dad, having difficulty getting the fishing rod through the trees, trailed slightly. And behind him came Jip, 2 boys, and Charlie and Chappie. The gobbler flew to the top of the chicken house. But Axel chattered so much when he tripped over the neck yoke of the sleigh that the bird unwisely left the security, and the mad rout started all over again. He flew to the top of the hayrack, loomed against the bright sky like a vulture as he peered about anxiously. "Try sneaking up on him," said Joe. "We'll wait here. You slip around into the shadow of the biffy. From there a good cast should get him." So while we all watched tensely, Dad sneaked up on the vigilant gobbler. This time the lump of lead whirled around the gobbler's outstretched neck, and we had him. The chase, which had occupied a thrilling hour, was over. Tranquility settled over the yard. The moon cast dark shadows on the trampled snow, and the rabbits ventured back to the woodpile. Reluctantly, Bill and I heeded the summons to bed. In the excitement, we had forgotten that it was Christmas Eve. "Hurry up and go to sleep," said Mother. "For Santa Claus will be along any minute now, and you know what happens if he comes around and little boys are not asleep. He goes away again." Go to sleep on Christmas Eve? When ideas of Christmas, of Santa, raced after each other through a boy's head? Why, you might as well take him to a circus and tell him to go to sleep. If, for an hour, he has galloped around in the moonlight in all the excitement of capturing the turkey gobbler, that makes it all the more impossible. For what seemed like hours, Bill and I turned and tossed, afraid of offending Santa Claus and trying desperately to go to sleep. Downstairs, as Mother worked in the kitchen, pots and pans rattled. Snatches of talk drifted up to us as Dad, Axel, and Joe reviewed parts of the recent chase. I became anxious, then angry, and marched to the head of the stairs. I scolded all and sundry for keeping us awake and for scaring Santa away. Mother came up to soothe our taut nerves, and just then from far down the road came the tinkling of Santa's sleigh bells. Even Mother stood in the darkness and listened as the sound of the bells came nearer. Up the road they came. Twice around the house they swung, then paused. Right out there in the moonlit yard, just beyond the blind which we dared not pull aside, Santa and his reindeer waited and listened, trying to find out if all the house were sound asleep. We dared not look out, because at the least peek he would discover us and away he would go. But you can't fool Santa. In a moment, with a gentle tinkle, his reindeer started up, and we could hear the receding bells as they made off rapidly past the barn and over the fields towards Paulson's. It was life's bitterest moment. Santa had come, heard the 3 men talking downstairs, and at the sound had passed us by. He would not return till next Christmas, if then. We had been tested and found wanting. If we were not asleep, it was not our fault. The blame on everyone else, on poor Mother, and especially on Dad, Axel, and Joe. Anger rose above our anguish. All the adults were in for bitter denunciation. That over, Bill and I laid down to sleep. The excitement of the hunt and the anticipation of Christmas had given way to despair. What wakes boys so early on Christmas morning? When the first streaks of dawn breasted Tracy's Hill, swept down over the east field, and lighted the roof of the barn, Bill and I were awake, peering into the gloomy recesses of the room. There, at the foot of the bed, were two stockings fairly bulging with oranges and nuts and toys. On either side of the bed were packages, a drum, a mechanical clown, books and mittens and moccasins. Santa Claus had relented, and the world was whole again. How were we to know that Santa had been very late making his rounds that night, and that we had heard only Joe Fowley running around ringing a set of sleigh bells? Christmas morning on the farm, you can't describe it. It's just a jumble of fleeting, gleeful moments as a boy's happiness jumps from this joy to that. Breakfast? Who wants breakfast with nuts and oranges and apples and candy piled all over the place? Who has time for breakfast with drums to beat, clowns to wind, and books to read? Even Tabby the cat knows it's Christmas, as with tail held straight aloft she stalks around sniffing at teddy bears, toying with wrapping paper or playing with a piece of string dangling from the large red Christmas bell in the center of the room. Even Jip, waiting outside, ever ready to welcome two boys emerging from the house and keen to get into whatever deviltry seizes their attention, even Jip knows it. And Bunty, as she turns her head to watch the milking, munching the while at an extra ration of oats, Bunty knows it's Christmas. Chappie and Charlie, chomping over extra bundles of green feed thrown down from the loft, know something is afoot as the barn door is open to let them out to gallop and frisk and kick up their heels on the way to the water trough. Then, when you want to put them in the barn again to harness them, they pretend they can't find the door. Inching slowly along, they stop to look in as if dimly they recognize it, but are not quite sure. And then with a toss of their head and a flip of the tail, they wing off and gallop around and around the barn. But it's all part of the fun, and for they too are going to Johnston's for Christmas Day. Going to Johnston's. You can get in your airliners and fly to Hawaii for Christmas. You can motor to Los Angeles for Christmas and the Rose Bowl game. You can assemble in Times Square and sway with the crowd as New Year comes in. But for me, I would like to turn back the years and celebrate another Christmas Day at Johnston's. Let Dad hitch Chappie and Charlie to the sleigh. Let Mother bundle her boys up in coats and mitts and scarves. Let her fill the sleigh with straw, blankets, and cushions, and carry out 2 stones heated in the oven to keep their feet warm. Let her tuck everybody in. Let Dad in his old sheepskin coat and moccasins and his moth-eaten old muskrat hat flip the lines to the horses as they start. Let all hear the bob of the bunks and the swish of the runners over the packed snow and the tinkle of the heel chains as gaily we swing down the trail. For today we are going to the Johnstons for Christmas dinner. In 100 yards, the trail left the farm behind, and for 2 miles, it picked its way between great trees of the forest. Soon it passed the gnarled balm blasted by lightning the previous August. And before that, this majestic giant had towered beyond the lesser trees, reaching far over their heads in a huge, rough column with tremendous arching branches bearing its dense, leafy canopy. Now, bereft of leaves and stark against the heavens, riven from top to roots, it loomed against the sky, twisted and terrifying. Then the sleigh slipped on past the bear tree, where 3 summers before he had climbed the green poplar. A bear had left the marks of his 4 claws on the soft bark, marks that since had turned to black, witch-like scars. Then on through the forest, past the willow flat where the moose had been shot. The sleigh track cut straight across the snowy whiteness of a little meadow, scarcely 100 yards across, surrounded with a frieze of willows and backed with its wall of evergreens. Countless rabbit tracks, mere shaded dimples in the soft whiteness, crisscrossed its powdery snow. On the fringe of willows and the spreading alders, the mystic tracery of hoarfrost clung in undisturbed, in breathless, sunny air, till the vibration of the passing sleigh shivered it off in dripping cascades of starlight to find repose on the white blanket. The meadow was still and silent. Motionless under every snow-piled branch or log sat a snowy cottontail, its presence revealed only by its black eyes, and nothing broke the stillness till the invasion of the swishing sleigh. In stillness and snowy whiteness, the rabbits celebrated their Christmas, for it was Christmas in the cathedral of the forest. Quickly we slipped along, and almost before we knew it, we were emerged from the forest into Johnston's field and swept on to the warm welcome of Johnston's hospitality. Christmas dinner at Johnston's. That was an experience never to be forgotten. And an experience, alas, no longer possible to duplicate. Yet the recipe for it is simple. Take the hungry stomach of an active farm boy that gnaws again an hour after any meal, give it a breakfast cut short by the excitement of new toys, bundle stomach and boys into heavy claws and whisk them in a farm sleigh 2 miles through the crisp, spruce-scented air. Let the boys run into Mrs. Johnston's kitchen. Let the aroma of roasting turkey fill his nostrils and the crackling of the basting fat assail his ears. That is your recipe. Garnish, if you wish, by letting his eyes dart about the kitchen. See, there on the shelf are 6 pies, 2 blueberry, 2 mince, and 2 low bush cranberry, still hot from the oven, their acrid smell blended with the odor of hot lard. On the stove, bubbling away in the big pot, is the Christmas pudding, its savory steam competing in gusto with all the other smells. Let this boy stand looking through the doorway with his back to the crackling kitchen, and before him the long log room, usually part dining room and part sitting room, but today all dining room. Let his eyes take in the red Christmas bell in the center, with its green paper streamers sweeping off to the corners of the room, and then the long table set for 10 and loaded with colorful, cheery Christmas goodies. Look at the piles of homemade crusty bread, the plates of cookies, plain or iced with red or green, and the red candles flickering their welcome. Look at the green of the cucumber pickles, the yellow of the mustard pickles, and the glowing red of pickled beets. And there, on the sideboard, right there enthroned in the very center, that is Mrs. Johnston's chocolate cake. What a cake! Made as only Mrs. Johnston can make it. 5 inches high, 2 layers, chinked with jam and roofed with a 1/4 inch of chocolate icing. And there to keep it company stands the huge bowl filled with preserved wild strawberries and flanked by 2 piles each of 5 ruby glass dessert dishes, while tucked into every vacant space on the sideboard are bowls of nuts, oranges, apples, and candy, a plate of jelly roll, and a pile of cinnamon buns. Over all presides Mrs. Johnston, beaming with friendship and with Christmas time and with pride in her handiwork. Let this boy slowly walk around the table and see all the side dishes. Here a dish of low bush cranberry jelly waiting for the turkey. There a jar of high bush cranberry jelly, and there some spiced black currants. Finally the glistening bowls awaiting the arrival of potatoes and carrots, and beside each of the 10 white plates, flanking each knife and fork, red and yellow and green Christmas crackers. Then, amidst all these sights and smells, make him wait nearly an hour while the turkey roasts to its brownest crackling excellence. Then seat everybody. Otis Johnston at the head, his face beaming and his bald head shining, while he whets away at the huge carving knife made from a piece of scythe blade and hafted with deer horn. Next, a chair for Mother, still busy in the kitchen, and beside it, Bill's chair. Then Pearl Johnston, placed so as to be able to tend both Bill and her younger brother, Charlie, and so on around the table. Mrs. Johnston, and Dad, and Lloyd, with me sitting beside him. Then Charlie rose with the iron gray beard, and Grandfather Johnston with his white one. Then let Mrs. Johnston carry in the turkey, while Mother brings bowls piled high with mashed potatoes, white and fluffy, and with rich golden carrots and the steaming dark brown gravy. Have Otis stand up and with deft strokes lay bare the white meat of the turkey breast and the dark meat of drumstick, and scoop out the dressing. Let no grim visage nor solemn discourse mar the pleasure of passing back for second helpings, and then following these with cake and cookies and pies and strawberries. Finally, lay before Otis the steaming Christmas pudding with its blue brandy flames flickering and following each other round and round about. There's your recipe for Christmas dinner at Johnston's, a boy's unforgettable Christmas dinner. For hours afterwards, Mother and Mrs. Johnston washed dishes, and before they were all dried, Lloyd and I were eyeing oranges and cracking nuts with a hammer. Soon Mrs. Johnston dug out the ice cream freezer, and this luxury, strange to a farm boy, would fill in any chinks that had developed as his enormous dinner settled. Then, as the early dusk dimmed the room, Old Man Johnston brought out his fiddle, and all joined in singing the old favorite songs. My Old Kentucky Home, Sweet Genevieve, Kathleen, Mavoureen, Killarney, and many more. All the while, Otis played the accordion, and Lloyd chimed in with his Jew's harp. Finally, the coal oil lamps were lit, and Mrs. Johnston began to prepare supper. But who, except the children, could eat any more? The adults had a cup of tea or coffee, and for courtesy's sake nibbled at some Christmas cake. The children, of course, did not miss the chance to start again, but alas, as Mrs. Johnston said, their eyes were bigger than their bellies. Sighs of satisfaction succumbed to sighs of surfeit, while heavy eyelids testified to the toll taken by Christmas. It was time to go home. Chappie and Charlie were soon hitched up to the sleigh, and amid repeated shouts of "See you at New Year's," they picked their way along the trail, winding through the twisted birches and the stark tamaracks. Bill and I were soon settled down in the bottom of the sleigh box, while Dad and Mother sat watching the trail ahead as it wound into the recesses of the forest. Before long, the little meadow was reached. On a winter forenoon, it had been beautiful in the brightness of fresh snow. By moonlight, a haze of mystery had dropped over it. Even Chappie and Charlie realized this. As to cross it, they slowed to a walk. Horses, heel chains, even the sleigh itself and its occupants were hushed in the presence of the sleeping meadow. The very shadows of the great black spruces seemed to tiptoe across it. The darker hollows of the crisscross rabbit tracks were now softened to blue, shadowy traces, running from bush piles to cavernous hollows under fallen logs. All around the edges of the meadow, the bright moonlight outlined the snow-laden branches of willows, alders, and spruce, each standing out clear and motionless as a mountain peak. Against the blue blackness of their shadows, each snow-capped tuft of grass, each snow-capped hummock of moss, each snow-capped knee of spruce stood out. And yet you couldn't be certain if this one or that was merely a cap of snow, or was in reality a rabbit hunched up and watching. The only way to tell was to throw a stick or shout, but in this shrine of the forest, sticks and shouting would have been a sacrilege. A whisper, maybe, was permissible, but no more. For tonight, the whole silent forest, and this sacred circle in particular, worshipped. And so the team and sleigh stole out of the little meadow and slipped along the trail, leaving the great trees to stand sentinel all through the night. Then out across the big meadow the horses trotted, swinging around the shadowy willows whose flaring branches were dotted with a dozen partridges huddled into balls, asleep, inky silhouettes against the streaming northern lights. The horses quickened their pace as they came to the rise that marked the ascent to our clearing. Their heel chains fairly rang now that they were in sight of the smokeless house and the shadowy barn, and in a moment we were home. Dad sprang out of the sleigh to unhitch the horses, glad of the exercise to revive chilled limbs. Mother climbed down carefully, and she and her two boys, mumbling with sleepiness, bumbled their way into the darkness and the chill of the farmhouse, whose wood fires had gone out hours ago. She groped for the lamp and lit it. Soon paper and kindling were piled on the fleecy gray ashes of the old, airtight heater. For a moment the match flickered, then caught the paper, and in minutes the fire was roaring away. I don't think that there is any kind of heater which warms an ice-cold room so quickly as these old-time ones. With hands nearly numb with cold, you stood around, and the very roar of the fire catching on the spruce log seemed to warm you. As soon as the fire was well established and roaring up the smoke pipe, you partially closed the damper in that pipe. At the same time, you burned your fingers as you screwed in the little damper low down on front of the heater. The adjustment of these two dampers was always a delicate one, because if it was not done exactly right, the fire would start to puff like a locomotive, and billows of smoke and spurts of flame nearly rocked the heater off its legs. Glowing red spots soon appeared on the metal sides of the heater. Then it was time to take off your cap and coat, for soon the room would be too warm. A wonderful thing was an old airtight heater. Soon the chill was off the living room of the MacGregor household, and before long it was time to go to bed. Well, that takes a bit of courage too, leaving the fire and climbing into an ice-cold bed. For 15 or 20 minutes the issue was uncertain. If you can stick it out long enough to warm the bed, you win, for the pile of blankets is a wonderful insulator. If you warm just that small part of the bed in contact with you, the blankets will keep the heat from escaping. Your face and nose, exposed to room temperature, may almost freeze, but never do. Soon you drop off to a blissful sleep. Thanks for sharing this story from one of your favorite books, Margaret. It was a pleasure reading it. I'm sorry we couldn't have done this in person on December 1st. But I do wish everyone a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and look forward to some more good reads in 2021.